Thank you, Ami. Beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful. Well, we have a full house. So did you guys think Edwene was kind of a hoot last week, those of you that were here? She's so funny. She really, could be a stand-up comic, couldn't she? I mean, she's just got that impeccable, the eye, the look, the timing, the whole thing. And she's brilliant, too. And she's very powerful in her messaging. So I've seen her speak, I don't know how many times, and she basically gives the same talk wherever she goes and uses the same jokes, and I laugh just as heartily every time I hear them. So there's something absolutely charming and in the moment that she brings. So we'll hope for that today, won't we? I'm starting a new series today that I'm excited about. Many of you may have already gotten into this book, because it's been out for, I think, 2 or 3 years, probably. This is my third time through this book. It's called The Untethered Soul. It's by, the subtitle is The Journey Beyond Yourself by Michael Singer. And this book, there's a few books out there that come around every once in a while that I think are so rich and deep that they can be, they can be a text for spiritual growth that you could keep at your night's side table and pick up and look at any page and have something very pithy and useful and relevant to your intention to grow spiritually. And this is one of those books, and it's so plain language. There's nothing, it has esoteric concepts, but they're very plainly written. And because of that, it's very accessible for everyone. It's interfaith, regardless of what a person's faith is. They could find very solid spiritual truths in this book and spiritual practices to help us grow and awaken. So I'm excited about going through that with you. We'll be doing it for 5 weeks, starting today, and then we'll take a break next week so Reverend Denise can do a special Mother's Day message. So we'll be having Denise here next week to share her heart and her message. And then we'll continue with this series for 4 more weeks after that. So you don't have to buy the book. We're not trying to sell books necessarily, but we do have some in the bookstore if you do want to pick up a copy and read along. I won't be following it exactly, so it won't be. If you're a linear person, oh boy. It'll be hard. I'm just not one of those, but I'll hit on some of the things that I think are good and inspire me. So one of the concepts that I think is important for us, just sort of to begin, today it'll just really be very, very general, and we'll just look at one particular idea. But before I even get into that particular idea, there's a word that I heard recently in my online reading that it just teased me into really more. And the word or the phrase was the democratization of enlightenment. Now that's some really two really important words. And obviously, democracy and enlightenment are words that probably could be talked about at great length and how important they are in our lives. But bringing those two words together really struck me as being important, because especially in a community like this and in the world in which we live, it feels like the biggest challenges that we have, the biggest conflicts that we have to do with this notion that spirituality is contained and it has a certain set of rules and doctrines, and that, the emphasis of these various faiths that abide by these rules and these doctrines suggests that there's only one way, or that you have to follow these particular ideas and these doctrines and these teachings, and that is the only way. And the democratization of enlightenment refers to this notion that spirituality is accessible to everybody. Spiritual growth is accessible to everybody. That we can all move closer to this divine reality. And that's even more true today than it's ever been. And there's the paradox. In a time when we probably have more clashes amongst religions who claim that they have the only way, there is this emerging wisdom that's saying, no, because the evolution of consciousness that's taken place, because we have evolved to the point where we have become more aware, self-aware, where consciousness is us at the point of awareness, reflecting back on itself, that we now have this ability to recognize who and what we are with a greater ability than we ever did before. Isn't that good news? Yes. Whether that's your reality right now, sitting in this chair or not, it's becoming increasingly apparent, and they're doing more and more scientific studies, studying all the different faith practices that use a contemplative approach, and are finding empirical type evidence, with the double-blind studies and all things that are done to make things more rationally substantiated, that there is an inward way, and that there is an actual opportunity for us to experience what we call these spiritual realities. We talk about oneness and unity and infinite love and all of this stuff. We talk about it conceptually, but there are so many spiritual practices today that are bearing witness to this reality, and that is no doubt a result of our ability to reflect upon ourselves more accurately and with less, an ability to dissociate from the distractions of life that would block and impede and obstruct the clarity that can come from deep reflection. What does that all mean? I have no idea, but I thought it sounded really good, so I wanted to share it with you this morning. Pick up the tape, listen to it a couple of times, and sometimes I just get lost in the esoteric and that's what that was. But I also feel that it's true, but it's not something that you have to take as truth. It's something you might reflect on and realize that what I'm always interested in is what are our allies in this work. And the more we can find that the universe and all of its components are conspiring for our awakening, the more likely it is that we are going to awaken. So when we know that we're not in this alone, and how many people have ever felt like their spiritual growth was what was the movie, Gravity? What's her name? Sandra Bullock, floating out there by herself. I mean, how many of us feel sometimes that we're just not doing it right, and it's lonely, and we're not, all of this kind of stuff. To recognize that there is this evolutionary impulse that's taking place through a collective consciousness of which we are a part, and it's pushing us, it's moving us into this greater awareness. Regardless of how perfected our practices are, there is that which is already taking place that is waking us up. Does that make sense? That's an easier way of saying, I think, what I was saying. Anyway, I got out of that one. So the untethered soul, he begins very foundationally with the quintessential questions of spiritual understanding or philosophy. The basic question is, what is the basic question? Who am I? Who am I? Right, who am I? And the words that were inscribed in whatever it was, the Temple of Delphi or something, know thyself. And in the Hamlet play, be unto thine own self be true. This is where we begin if we are really interested in spiritual growth. It's not the outside-in approach, it's the inside-out approach. It's really knowing the territory of where you're going to experience life. And we know the territory oftentimes in a very superficial way, but this book is about knowing the nuance. It's knowing the subtle ways in which we identify with ourselves, which are false, so that we can find the more true ways of realizing who we are and identifying. So a couple of quotes in here that are worth sharing with you this morning. He says in here, well, let me back up. The one thing that he talks about extensively in the first couple of chapters is this idea that we have a voice in our head that's constantly narrating our experiences. Anyone familiar with that? The voice in the head that's always talking, blah, 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 blah. And that voice in our head, we become so sort of, we're so unaware of it in a way that we just think it's us. We think that the voice in our head is us. But the truth is that the voice in our head is just a voice in our head, right? And so he goes to great lengths to make sure that you don't take that voice in your head too seriously. And he says here, and this is his opus statement about all this, he says, there's nothing more important to true growth, nothing more important to true growth than realizing that you are not the voice of the mind. You are the one who hears it. You are the one who hears it. So think about that. Think about that. You are the one who hears it. We rarely think in terms of observing what goes on in our mind. We're maybe very much aware of what's going on in our mind, but we hardly ever observe it. We just let it happen willy-nilly. And there's this that's a big word, discursive thought that's going on all the time. The meandering mind, right? Does anyone know about the meandering mind? And it doesn't even sometimes finish sentences. It doesn't finish thoughts before it goes off somewhere else. And it's just like, watching a puppy, sniffing in the garden, running here, running there, running there. It never even finishes the one sniff before it's off sniffing somewhere else, And that's how our mind is. And this is not something to be taken seriously. Do you understand? Do I understand? And yet we do, don't we? We think that voice in the mind is like our best buddy, but it's like the roommate from hell. It's like your worst roommate, the one that could really mess up your life besides your dorm room, It's like, could really just take you down the wrong path. And we give it a lot of credence. Now this isn't to say that we're going to go beat up our roommate, We're not going to condemn that voice. But the point of this whole thing is to move from being sort of identified with the voice and just seeing it as being real and being us, most importantly, and recognizing that the one who hears is more essentially who we are. There is the voice. And then behind that is the one who is aware of that voice. And he says comically in the book, he says, you may be sitting there thinking, I don't have any voice in my head. That's the voice I'm talking about. So I thought that was good. So those of you who thought that you were not in this category and thinking that thought, now you know what I'm talking about. So there you go. So I'm just trying to contain this morning because we have a lot to do today. But let me give you this too. I love this story, and it sort of illustrates in an interesting way how we might move from this small self, this self that's identified with a voice, and for this endless series of wants and desires that are never satisfied. No matter, we get one and then we want something else, and we just think if all of our problems were solved, that would be it. But have we not realized that as soon as one problem is solved, another one pops up, and that part of us that we think is us is what causes us to suffer. And so spiritual growth has to do with moving away from identifying with that particular self that is never happy and can never get enough of its needs met, and moving into that part of us that is connected with something more true and eternal and lasting, okay? So that's what we're trying to do here, trying to realize our divine nature. So the story is this, and many of you have heard this. Have you ever watched TED Talks? Yeah, okay. TED Talks are 18 to 20-minute talks that you can find on the internet, and they're ideas worth spreading. That's how they tag these ideas. And they're always by some really smart and brilliant people, and I wish they would invite me someday, but I don't think that's going to happen. But anyway, one really bright, beautiful spirit woman by the name of Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, a well-known story of her, she tells, and you can look this up and hear it for yourself, but she tells basically in an 18-minute talk about the result of a massive stroke that she experienced. And in that massive stroke experience, what happened for her was the part of her brain, the left part of her brain, really became increasingly non-functional. And she was becoming incapacitated physically. but there was something really remarkable that was going on at the same time as she was really realizing, and she was very bright, and she's a brain scientist, so she knew she was in trouble as long as the left side of her brain was functioning, because that's the part of us that can judge and discern and so forth, and that's the part that can even get us freaking out, So she's aware of that, but then as this part of the brain is sort of like relaxing and becoming less dominant in her awareness, the right side of her brain is becoming increasingly aware. And the right side of her brain is the part of her that can experience love and this sort of this oceanic field of connection and unity and oneness. And this is what's beginning to emerge in her. Now, she's a hard and fast brain scientist, so she's really having difficulty, while now her awareness is moving into what would be considered the nondescript, the ethereal, the amorphous kind of reality that we talk about in spiritual terms. But it's so real for her. And she's leaning up against the wall with her arm. And she's realizing that as she's staring at her arm, that the arm appears to be merging with the wall. She knows this ain't right. The left side of the brain would see, and it's like, oh, there's something really wrong here. But when she's sort of back in this unified state of consciousness, it all seems exactly right. It feels like an ultimate truth, an ultimate reality. And so she's going through this experience. She goes from having moments of sort of left brain clarity and knowing that she could be in trouble, to going back into this blissful state. And she prefers the blissful state, don't we all? And ultimately, she has enough coming back to her senses that she's able to get help. And so she's able to call for help, and she does have, an ambulance comes and takes her, and she gets medical help. And over a period of about 8 years, she actually recovers completely from this stroke, and she's fine. But she then does this TED Talk. And the reason she gives this TED Talk and why she feels that it's an idea worth spreading is this. She says, now we know the left brain, we know that the rational mind, we know it's important. She says, but in that experience, I became so aware of connection, of love, of peace, that I've never experienced before in my life. This is the reality that I would love to live in. And she said, if you were given the choice, which would you pick? The separate, discrete, concrete, rigid, rational, or that which would give you a sense of oneness with people, with life, with love? And she said, and which would be and make a better world? That's my question for you, she said. And then she ends her talk. Now, I think that we need both, don't you? I think we need both. But aren't we really on one side so heavily favoring that left brain, which is so good at seeing differences? It's so good at seeing separation. It's so good in seeing this being different from that, and comparing, and all of those things which are important for us to make discernment in this physical world so that we can operate in this physical world. But they really do undermine our desire to have harmonious relationships. They undermine the peace that's possible amongst diverse cultures and faiths. The more sense that we had of a universal connection, a oneness, a love that is not just, if you love me, I'll love you back, but a love that's our essential nature. The more we had that, the more we would feel united, and we would be able to solve what really ails us and what causes us to suffer individually and collectively. So, if we are to move in that direction, we don't necessarily have to have a stroke. I don't want any of you to go out and think, oh God, I got to have a stroke to have this oneness reality. I don't think I'm willing. And we know that there's people who have had near-death experiences and have had that same kind of awareness, that sense of oneness and love and peace and connection with all of life, and all the separation feelings go drop away. But do you have to die? Do you have to come close to death in order for this to happen? Now, I think what we need is a near-life experience. I think that's really what's needed. And we can all have a near-life experience. And what that is moving away from this sense of separation by taking on what this book proposes to support us in, and that is moving away from the self that identifies as a separate, discrete, skin-encapsulated ego, and to begin to see ourselves in a bigger and grander and a more inclusive way. And that is this notion of moving from being identified with the objects in our life and becoming more identified with ourselves as the subject. Because when we observe something, there is that which we observe, that's the object, that's your partner, that's your job, that's the world, that's everything that's out here in your life, that's even your relationships, your job, your circumstances in life. And then there's the one who observes. And if we're identified with the stuff that's happening out here, we feel very vulnerable, don't we? Because don't we know those things are like the shifting sands of life that are good and bad, and everything's going well and we're happy. And if we're tied to that sort of notion, then we are really never going to get to that peace, never going to get to that sense of love and wholeness and connection. But if we can back up, and this is really what this book is about, what the Untethered Soul is about. If we really want to liberate the soul, then we have to stop being hooked to that which is not us, so that we make room for an awareness of the us that is more true. So by beginning with just noticing the voice, and you can go out and do this today, when you're driving along or whatever is happening, and you hear the thought, and instead of just like letting the thought take you away, as if someone just grabbed you and pulled you up on the horse and said, away you go, or the bus, whatever the analogy we used a couple weeks ago, is that you can go, oh, here comes that thought. Now, I can be aware of that thought, and I can just watch it. And by watching the thought, the purpose is not to analyze it or to judge it. Don't get that, because we really do that really well, but that's not so good either. But if we understand that by watching it, we become more keenly aware of that we are one who can watch. We are one who can observe. We are one who can witness that kind of activity. Then we are beginning to reconstruct the essence of us, our essential self. Our essential self is not our body and not what happens to us and not our circumstances of life. Our essential self is non-physical. It is awareness itself. It is consciousness itself. And that, when we can get to that place of realizing that who we really are is the consciousness itself and not what we are conscious of, then that is a portal to the divine reality. That isn't divine reality, but it's a portal to it. Because we're backing away from separation, we're backing away from object reference, and we're moving to a subjective awareness of life. And I know this is really intellectual for some of you, and I apologize, but I'm just setting the tone. As we go forward in the next 4 weeks, we will be talking about specific practices that will enable us to begin to untether our soul, to begin to free our spirit, to be able to, sort of pull the weeds out that are the obstructions, that are the impediments to the realization of this grander self. It's a very practical book, even though it starts with a sort of this lofty premise and idea that we are awareness and we are consciousness itself. So you've got 2 things going for you. You've got 3 things going for you. There's probably more than that. The one thing you have going for you is what I started with, which is that there is an evolutionary impulse that is working at the level of you right now that's seeking to know itself through you. And because that is consciousness trying to become conscious of itself, that's you at the point of your awareness waking up. That's you becoming aware of your more essential self. So you've got an evolutionary driver behind you. Then you have the fact that you're tired and sick and tired of living the other way. You get what Jill Bolte Taylor says about, if I'm identified with all of the externals, if I just keep seeing life and I see myself as a separate being, how much more suffering there is to that than moving into an awareness of this undifferentiated self that merges with love and with life. Effortlessly, not if I could finally get her to, be nice to me, I'd love her. No. This is like love that comes just because that's who you are. That's the kind of love we're talking about. So you've got that going for you. And then you've got these teachings and the book, if you decide to get it. So what I'd like to do with you is take you through a little bit of a process this morning. And this is just like a minor, a mini experience. So if you close your eyes with me, if you would. And just put everything down, put everything aside for a moment as we allow ourselves to be held by this universe, by love, by God, by whatever we consider to be the greater presence in our life. And as we sit in this space, as we sit in this place, let us become aware of who we are. And when I say that, just invite you to answer that question. Whatever comes, who am I? See what comes. And if you get an answer, whatever the answer might be, see if you can ask for more information. And see, is that all who you are? Is there more to who you are? And listen for whatever the adjectives or descriptors that might arise as you ask that question. It's the most important question. And an existential quest for truth. And now, I would like for you to consider, where did your answers come from? Is it somebody else's truth? Where does it come from? What's the root of those answers? And now as you listen, who heard the answers? Who asked the questions? Who is the one who right now is just aware and has the capacity to watch all of this going on? Not the eyes, but just awareness itself. Can you know yourself as awareness? Go deeper. Drop below the surface mind. Into a place of being aware. And in this place, when you're not interested in what you are aware of, but only that awareness itself. See if you can feel the peace. Just aware. Just aware. It all comes and goes, and there you are, witnessing the sights, the sounds, the thoughts, and there you are. Suggesting that this is the domain of the awakened self. This is where the soul is free. And this is who you and I have come here to be. It's the doorway to the divine, to love, to unity, and to peace, and to a deep abiding wisdom. So this is where we shall find our peace and our wisdom and our love when we cannot find it in the objects of our awareness. We thank you, Spirit, that you are the guide in this journey beyond ourselves to our true essence, where we live and move and have our being in your presence, in your love, in your life. And so it is. Amen.